Night show.
Look at you. Infinite potential. Infinite possibilities. Infinite failures. But it's all up to you. The choice is yours. To be the most divine.
Hello, Miss Flood. This is the Night Show, and I'm very lucky and I'm very honored to have my good friend Katrina Fludd. Katrina, give the folks a rundown of what you do, your educational background, your professional background.
Yes. Hi, Stephen. We're finally doing
Hello.
this.
I know. I'm super excited.
So a little about me. I am currently starting my own business, which I'm really excited about. It's called Kelda
Okay.
Co. And it's consulting around diversity and inclusion. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 years in education, nonprofit sectors, and figuring out what that means for me now, being an entrepreneur, really.
Right.
After
Yeah.
being an educator in education for so long and focusing on mentoring young people, a lot of education around diversity, inclusion, race, sexism, and all of that good stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's been the last 10 years of my life after leaving Maryland.
Okay. Okay. So graduate from Babson. That was undergrad,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And where'd you go from there? Just
I
so
came
folks
back
have a
home.
context, 'cause I know what you're doing. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what I'm doing now, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so after college I came back home and that wasn't the plan, but that was
Mm-hmm.
2008 when the economy went crazy
Yep.
and
Yep.
knowing that I had this passion around diversity and inclusion. I mean, at that time, there weren't a lot of jobs, period, let alone people actually caring about diversity and inclusion. So I decided to come home and begin figuring it out, asking myself questions
Yeah.
like, what just happened to me? What did I learn? It's funny, I actually focused on starting my spiritual journey
Mm-hmm.
right after undergrad because there were so many unknowns, and it was at that time that I
Mm-hmm.
was like, when else am I going to really have the time to focus on me like this? So that
Mm-hmm.
alongside a job search where it was like, okay, well, I have this degree in entrepreneurship. So what do I do now? And at the time, a friend of mine was in New York, and we literally would be on the computer all day on GChat. I was looking for
Mm-hmm.
jobs. She had a job, but it was like, what are we doing? Right? This is not
Right.
why we
Right.
went to
Right.
school. We're not going to
Yeah.
be online mindlessly chatting to each other all day. So we found this awesome global program that allowed me to study entrepreneurship, but do it
Mm-hmm.
on a global scale and really get into outside of the US. You know, what does diversity and inclusion look like on a global scale? And I needed to understand, how do I talk about this to all people, right? Up until then, it had been trying to convince students, right? People on college campuses, but to really look at the global marketplace and think about how do you get people to value something like diversity and inclusion. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I spent a year abroad. First, we went to France, then to China, and then back in the US. So, spent a whole year deep diving into each of those regions, history, culture, business, law, and entrepreneurship, which was fascinating. Obviously, had a lot of fun, and I did that with close to 100 people from all over the world. So, it was this opportunity for me. Here I am, this black girl from Capitol Heights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Already spent 4 years up in the corner of Wellesley, but then took a year to sort of figure out my next step. And at the end of it, still had questions.
Yeah.
Still had questions. But that's what got me, at least. That's what happened right after undergrad.
Okay. What do
Yeah.
you think? I mean, you're going to so many places. You said China, like going to France. What were the similar like struggles or the issues or the concerns when you were like hanging out with the French folks and they were telling you certain things? Like what were their diversity and inclusion issues?
It was more actually their understanding of diversity and inclusion, right? It's not really a
Mm,
conversation over there.
mm,
You know, their most salient identity might be nationality. You know,
mm,
so at the school that I was at, it was a business school, right? So there was already a
mm-hmm,
certain type of students and people that I was interacting with, right?
mm,
And yeah, that it wasn't a conversation, and that in of itself was fascinating to me, right? Because
yeah.
in undergraduate, I had been in an international space, but to then be the international student and be with people who value differences, right? But they didn't need to have the
Mm-hmm,
conversations around race, for instance. They didn't need to have those conversations. Instead, we could just be human. What a
mm-hmm.
concept. So that was striking to me. Not unexpected, but it did
Right.
make me calculate, okay, so I need to think about, I mean, that was France, but we can assume that that's probably how most Europeans have that conversation, right? It's about multiculturalism, and the constructs around race aren't really as popular yet. Well, at that time, that was when the economy was on everyone's mind, so the
Right.
conversations were different. But yeah, that was the big takeaway for me, and that in class too, right? The school
Mm-hmm,
that I was at, I had to be aware that I was already around a very privileged, right, group of people,
right.
versus when after class we would go into the cities and go into the bars, and then you would see the segregation, right? You would see
Right.
the black bars, etc. And then it became a challenge for me because where do I hang out? I can stretch myself and get into
Mm-hmm,
new circles, and I certainly did. But I wish I would have tuned into black people in France while
mm-hmm.
I was over there,
Yeah.
to build that community. But yeah, those were the similarities in France, and then China was just completely night and day, right? That was my first time in the East, right? It's one thing to read
Mm-hmm,
about it, but you get off the plane and you smell everything and you see those signs that you can't read. And, again, I was a student, so I was taken care of. I didn't have to navigate
mm-hmm.
on my own. But yeah, you can imagine diversity and inclusion in China is not a conversation, right?
Right.
So it was fascinating, my experience being black, right? How people were
Right.
looking at me, people wanted to take pictures, that sort of thing. And so it was less about diversity and inclusion, the conversation, and me beginning to understand the nuances, if you will, and how the conversation in the US isn't big enough, right?
Mm,
For instance, I learned more about marketing from being in an actual market in China than I can
right.
learn in a classroom with a textbook about marketing, right?
Right.
So it was those sorts of experience which also taught me about my unique ability to be in that conversation, right? Because
Mm,
again, here I am, black girl from Capitol Heights now, but I'm American, but I'm in China where I'm perceived as what they see in front of them,
mm-hmm.
which for all intents and purposes, I mean, I'm racially ambiguous, so who knows where I who knows where I come from? That's another story. But yeah, that was the year of me sort of broadening the conversation in my head around diversity and inclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and getting ramped up to do the work in this country around rooting the conversation, because clearly it's not big enough, and the conversation isn't happening anywhere else. So
Yeah.
that's my heady answer. But then I also realize that that's how I think about these things, and that's a good thing. But it would just be really hard for me, long story short, to start a business and consult about that. Like, how do you consult about something that people aren't aware of, you know? And
Yeah.
that is so contentious and means so many different things across the globe.
I'm trying to figure out what part to start in
I
a
know
rebuttal
that's
of
a
what you
lot.
said. Right?
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a
It's a
lot.
lot.
And that was
But I like the.
good.
I like that you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I like that you brought up the fact that you learn more from being in a market in China. Learn more about marketing from being in a market in China than you could from a textbook. Because it's like those kinesthetic learners who have to like, oh, okay, you can teach me this thing, but then I have to actually go out and do it
Right.
and like watch it, do the trial and error, like watch me fail or watch me fly, like in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like kind of how you said, like in the conversations of being in academia and being surrounded by these people who are enlightened in a way, have the education,
Right.
but then say, are you going once this conference is over, once this thing is over, where we all can like pat each other on the back and say we learned a lot and we become better, deeper thinking human beings? Are you then taking
Exactly.
that knowledge back to where you're from?
Exactly. Exactly. And I wanted to know, like, what knowledge beyond this textbook am I supposed to be
Mm,
taking back? You know?
yeah, yeah,
So an example of like being in that market, it sort of looked like a warehouse. You know, the buildings are open, and this was like
mm,
vendors could have booths. It was sort of like a mall, right? For all intents, it was a
right,
mall, and there's like 50 nail salons. And of course, I'm in China. I like to get my nails done. I wanted to get my nails done.
mm,
But
mm,
it was funny how competition played out, right? So here I am, this black
mm,
girl. So, people are like, oh, foreigner. But seeing how two nail salons competed to get me to come to them,
mm.
that was the first interesting part. But then I would go over to their booth, and Steven, it straight up looked like a beauty supply store. Like, all the all of the wigs, all the ponytails, all the weave lined up, loud
Yeah,
music
yeah, yeah.
playing, like everything essentially that would be called ghetto in
Hmm.
our country was a norm for them, and something
Right.
that here I was competing for it. And I thought about places like Capitol Heights where you go down a block and it's what, two nail salons, two liquor stores,
Hmm.
those sorts of things. So I
Hmm.
began to start to make those connections about how basically I vowed that no one could ever call me ghetto when I went back to the United States. Like,
Right. Right.
because calling someone ghetto, understanding how that played out in China, it was like, nah, I can't go back to the United States
Yeah.
and be classified as this.
And that word, man, is so like, because I mean, the origins going back even further to like the Nazis and sticking Jews in those like small cramped areas, and then just like methodically like seeing how they act. Like, oh, if we put these people in these cramped positions, don't allow them to move that much, don't allow them to have certain jobs, access limited space, limited resources, the crime rate is gonna go up.
Right,
And it's just like now you're just referring to that in the current tense as like, oh, the nails, the
right.
hair, the popping, the talk, and all this other shit is like, it's kind of it's a trick of the mind in a way for me, like how I take it in. Um, but yeah, it's like you're always in this currency exchange with words when
Right.
you're, especially in, yeah, with as time goes forward, like you're always in this currency exchange with words. And it's funny. I think of like, what is ghetto gonna look like in 50 years?
Right.
Like when people say that, it's like, is that gonna mean like, are people who are gonna say ghetto, but that's gonna be like the people who are black and insanely rich and
Right.
once lived here, and now they're like, oh, that's the bougie now. It's like, oh,
Right.
she
Right.
is
Right.
so ghetto. It's
Right.
like the tone and inflection might change at some time.
Yeah. And that's, I
Uh,
mean, and what I also realized was that ghetto was starting to mean anything that wasn't white and anything that
yep.
wasn't Western, right?
Hmm.
So in being in that same city and then seeing new buildings go up, new condos, and
Hmm.
those being explicitly the desirable areas, right? That's
Hmm.
and all of a sudden, I mean, this is China, and I'm seeing huge billboards with white women marketing products, right,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
that market. And so here I am in a Chinese classroom with international people, learning about economics and marketing, etc., but seeing how it's playing out and seeing how my culture and other cultures are all being detailed and looked at as less than almost, but yet here we
Mm.
are thriving and creating these micro economies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to tap into that and started to, what do we have to see about each other so that those sort of micro communities can flourish?
Mm.
Yeah, how can I what can I do with that? That's what
Yeah,
that
and that is like, yeah. I'm just whole time been thinking like, oh, how do you make this work? And like, because if you and we've had this conversation like offline a bunch of times, like, how do you explain to a company how diversity and inclusion is going to make you a profit?
right.
It's like, okay, take a percentage of any demographic of any racial, socioeconomic group, and say like, oh, how many people within this group buy our product?
Right.
And it's like of that entire demographic, 5%. Why? It's like, well, we don't make we don't align with their values. We don't this, that, and the other. And it's like, all right, well, how is that going to impact? Should we care about this? And then you start looking at like what the face of America is going to change, like with the amount of like mixed kids being born, like the country is slowly
Majority
becoming
minority.
that whole trick of the mind as well.
Right.
It's interesting how you get labeled a minority, and there's literally I hear this term all the time. It's like,
Right.
oh, there's a billion Chinese, and I'm like, there's a billion Africans as well. There's a billion Africans as
Exactly.
well, and what we would classify as like European or white is 1/10 of the global well, less than 1/10 of the global population
Right.
now. It's the numbers, the birth rate's going down, so that's something to take into account. But if you're a company and you're trying to like figure out why you need diversity and inclusion, your customer base is about to change in less than 20 years.
Right. Like now.
Yeah, like right
Right.
now, that's if a generation is 25 years, in one generation, your entire customer base is going to look real different.
And then they
So
would say
you
to
might,
you, right, and then, they would say, okay, well, we'll look at, shifting our target market. But then what I realized is where people create the ideas of their target market also has to be changed. And so
exactly.
I began to think about, on a very basic level, when startups, when people want to create a new product or service, what do they need to know in terms of diversity and inclusion while they're creating their target market? I think about people online now as I'm thinking about my business model for my company and how I have this conversation with people, helping them build products or services and almost engineering it in from the beginning for your own for your benefit. How do you create a target market and not exploit people? There's
Right.
nothing wrong. So, for instance, with China, there's nothing wrong with luxury markets wanting to get into China, but how can you leverage these markets that it already
Right.
exists?
Right.
And so I continued to ask that question, but I also knew that if I really wanted to answer that question, I would need different experience. So up until that
Mm-hmm.
point, even though I had been intentional about getting the more hands-on learning, right? So I sat in the
Mm-hmm.
classroom, but this program really allowed me to, you know, see it and touch it. But then I knew that I had to now go into an organization and really try to engineer what business students needed to learn about
Mm-hmm.
diversity and inclusion. So I went to work at the school that I had went to both undergrad and graduate
Mm-hmm.
because for the same reason I attended, there's people from all over the world, and representation already wasn't an issue. And that's where a lot of companies get stuck. They can't even start to think about diversity inclusion because they have to focus on recruiting.
Right.
So the question of, okay, what is diversity and inclusion? My approach, I wanted to think of all the ways in which people are different and think about the structure of the college and how we, at each touch point, let's say, of a student, you think
Mm-hmm.
about a student matriculating, how do we not focus on helping the Black students, not focus on helping the Latino students, but each individual student understanding what they need, and then also having specialized resources. Long story short, I spent 5 years trying things, right? Let's just do it. Let's just build these programs. And then I ran up against the reality that higher education is a mess. And
Really? You don't
really,
say.
it's a mess. And I assumed so, but I just needed to see how much of a mess. And remember, so I went and studied business, but then essentially that's the nonprofit sector, right?
Mm,
And I just realized that it was expected that I was to come into a role of diversity and inclusion and just focus on what it felt like to me was focus on the Black kids who are complaining or who don't feel welcomed, right? Just how do we
mm,
make sure people feel welcomed? Because I was one of those students in my undergrad who was like, "Dear white people, fix this."
right. Yeah. I remember.
So, yep. So then they hired me and said, "Okay, fix it, Miss Floyd," right? So I was like, all right, well, I learned this methodology of taking an idea and making it into an opportunity. So if our idea is that everyone is to be included, let's go through the same steps that we would if we were to
Mm,
create a product or service. But I realized that I was thinking too much, and the thinking that I was using was unique. And this is, of course, in hindsight. But I was using what's now called design thinking, right? I was doing it,
mm,
but I didn't know it was that. So, long story short, I had a lot of aha moments about how we do it, but I realized that people, that's not how people see diversity and inclusion. People want diversity and inclusion to be, or they're used to it. I want to come in a room and I want to talk about content. I want to talk about race. I want to talk about issues.
mm.
And if they want to do something about it, they get as far as creating a committee. And then that committee or task force will meet.
All the nice buzzwords.
All the what?
All the beautiful buzzwords that are filled with action
Yes.
and promise and hope.
Yes. Yes. And lots of beautiful pamphlets with rainbow
Hmm.
coalitions on top. And,
Hmm.
you get that email and that excitement because you're someone who's worked in the organization, or you're just a person of color who cares, or you are a white person who really wants to be a lifelong learner, right? Or
Hmm.
just you care and you don't know what to do. So yeah, these organizations pull together these people, and but they stop at, okay, so you all have a committee or a task force, bring back recommendations of what we should do. And so I was frustrated. All of a sudden I felt like a mad scientist, right? So here I am being obsessive almost about diversity and inclusion, but then going to conferences and seeing that the people doing that work were remaining in an academic mindset, right? Let's just take a theory and create a framework so that we can teach it or talk about it. People seem to be scared, if you will, to go beyond
Mm.
that. I really picked up on that fear, and that wasn't new to me, right? That
Yeah.
wasn't new. You know that all people are afraid to talk about difficult topics, etc. But
Right.
I have
Right.
to say, I was taken aback at how scared people were, especially people who want to go out and change the world, especially business people.
Mm.
So I guess I'm saying that knocked me down a few notches, right? Like,
Yeah.
I was really passionate about diversity and inclusion, went to business school, but then when it was like, all right, so how do you create a business? How do you really create something that creates value? It was this slow
Mm.
process of realizing you have to admit to yourself it's not valued.
Mm.
It's a value that people say, we value this, but people don't understand the many levels, or people don't want to take it serious enough as a discipline. So I just kept I kept trying, just kept doing different events and or creating different structures, right? Because I knew that I wanted to get past the idea of a committee. I wanted to create systems and structures. I mean, I was a one woman show. I was literally given an office, which is more than a lot of people who do diversity work are given. But I really wanted to set up a center, right? I studied business, so I wanted to come in and I was thinking, okay, how do I market this? What's the vision for this? What is the mission down to the task and the annual reporting? What does that look like? But what I kept bumping up against was people, I couldn't get out of the product development phase, if you will. And so I left. I spent 5 years. I spent the first 5 years of my career banging my head up against the wall in a place that wasn't new to me, but I had to admit to myself that I was new, right? So I went back to Maryland. That seems to be a theme. I was like, I don't know where I want to go, but I'm done here.
Yeah.
And was determined to start my own, right? Like if I have this methodology and this approach and I just need to keep working it, then I'll do that. And then in the midst of doing that, I got a call from a large research institution and worked in human resources, which was a shift for me because I had been working in education and students, and now I was working with employees, and was actually pleasantly surprised that I was able to get beyond the committee. I was able to get beyond the committee, and people were listening to me in different ways because I was beyond the bubble of content and talking about these difficult conversations and race, etc. And if you think about it, I think in most workplaces, it's limited, right? How deep you can get into some of those conversations.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So, for me, in the way that I work, I was like, okay, I have another constraint in my mad scientist project, right? I have to think about how do I now connect these sort of issues and things. And then, surprisingly, I think I felt like I was able to get, I guess, a prototype where I felt like this idea of design thinking now matched with the content that I wanted to create. And so began to think about how do I build a business where I can offer this as a service to other people. In the same way that you would hire any other consulting firm to come in and do it, I now had a methodology, I now had an approach that started me at a place where a lot of people can't get beyond. They can't get beyond the committee. So I'm able to set up an organization in a way that uses different language, right? If I can talk about design thinking and innovation, it might not be as scary.
Right.
And then use that as content. I know I'm rambling, but
Well, you're good. I did have a question.
Yeah.
I have one question. So, do you think it's like, people, we hear like in a meeting, like, oh, all these liberal colleges posting this, that, and the other, but like in any organization, almost all of them are very conservative, not necessarily on just like their political views or whatever, but they're conservative on being like risk averse. Like we have these forms, we have these orders, we have these precedences, we have our principles, and yet there is this problem. But if we try to implement this and it doesn't work out, how are we going to recover? What happens if this teacher leaves, or what happens if? And it's like, well, it's funny how like so many organizations are so radical when they start, but then they become very antiquated.
Yes.
And outdated in their thinking as they start to progress further.
Right.
And that stagnation, that cognitive stagnation, kind of puts them in a box, and they eventually start to flounder and fail.
Right. But at least in the organizations I've been in, floundering and failing to institutions that have been around since for as long as the country has been around, floundering and failing is subjective. And that's what I've seen. There's a sort of apathy, right? Like,
Spin. Yeah.
flounder and failing, like, we gonna be all right. Like, we don't need to change, right? And what I realize is like, you're right. For all intents and purposes, you really don't have to change anything. Which was terrifying for me, right? Having spent, all this time really thinking that I could change organizations, but then realizing that, it's like some people say, okay, well, you don't have to be for everyone. And so that's when I began to realize, like, all right, there are going to be some organizations who, like you said, are very risk averse. And then I'm just going to have to partner with the ones that aren't. And the ones who are willing to take a risk, I also realized that I have to stop just saying diversity and inclusion, and I have to explicitly say anti-racist. And that alone is its own risk, right? That's a conversation that people don't want to have. It's politically volatile. It could cost you profits, right? It could cost you investments. It could cost you a lot. But I think you have to ask the question as leaders of the organization, like, what is the purpose of your organization? What's the real return? And you hear in the business community, you don't hear it enough, but balancing a triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. And really establishing that it is, in fact, possible to balance all three. And if you do, right, then in that people portion, that's diversity and inclusion. So, again, that's why I wanted to focus on design thinking, for instance, because that's something that essentially white men created out in Stanford. And it was actually interesting for me to just see, like, creativity from that just became another challenge for me, right? So moving away from the content of diversity and inclusion, which can be risky, even into the more of the context and looking at the approaches, I saw that too, had its own biases, right? Because in reality, at the end of the day, design thinking is keeping who are you designing for? It's about keeping the humanity of whoever you are designing something for at the forefront. And so here this is this breaking research and this thing that can help companies. So it's like, if we actually went into any organization or any community in this country and centered the voices of the most vulnerable and actually were intentional about how we design systems for them, we would be a lot further. So the gap in the question for me became like, really? If this methodology is so powerful, then why aren't we applying it to some of the things that we think are so risky? And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of organizations that are using it, but still, when it comes to in your organization, your community, or your country, how are you at any given time managing people, but managing all of the identities that they bring? We say we want people to show up as their best self. No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yeah, no.
You don't.
That's very prevalent. Yeah. And you can see that by like grooming standards. You can see that like requirements for, you still got, the military just changed. And that the military is obviously very conservative. But as far as black women wearing their natural hair, I have to keep saying that, so it reinforces not only just myself but people listen.
Right.
Their natural hair in their own way. That has only been not even a couple of years. It hasn't been 5 years yet.
Isn't that crazy?
And you see that in corporate. Yeah, you see that in corporate America. You see that in you always see like some wild cases in Texas where some kid who has locks is like, you can't wrestle. We're gonna cut your hair in the middle of the match. We're gonna kick you out of school because, and it's like that is some some post reconstructionist bullshit. Like, you need to wrap your hair because it offends my whiteness, my European identity, and it's toxic, and I don't want to see it. So put a bag over it. It's like, oh, okay. And then you see it sold back to you
Right. Right.
in 2020, where people will copy and paste it and then rebrand it and remarket it, and it's like, oh, we made this thing. Like, no, you didn't, and actually, you persecuted my entire people because of the exact same thing you're trying to claim as original now.
Exactly. It's mind-boggling, and then to put policies in place against it, right? It's one thing to
Yeah.
have that prejudice, but to put these policies in place. I'm reading. I think I told you I'm reading Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. Highly
Yeah, I just bought
recommend.
it, and I'm gonna start it tomorrow.
Yeah, it took me a while to get
Yeah.
to it because honestly, Stephen, and it's interesting. Only white people were coming to me asking, "Have you read this?" And I was like, "No." Like, how to be anti-racist? Like, I can, you want, I can write that book if you want, right? Like, right? But as I read it, I understood why a lot of people need to read it, right? Because I mean, without the short of it is he answers what I think a lot of people don't realize, and I think it's holding us back from a lot of those things is black people can be racist. And I'll admit I was someone who would say, no, no, that's impossible. But I now
I still
understand.
struggle with that myself. Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough, and he breaks
Yeah.
it down, and I like the way he breaks it down, and he talks about his own experiences growing up and his own caricaturization. I'm gonna get that right, caricaturization of
Yeah.
of his blackness and how, you know, whether it was skin complexion or how we should dress. You know, he realized that he too was being racist because of white supremacy. He doesn't deny that, but but the way that he wraps it, right? And he's trying to push us to action, right? He's like, we can't move on if we don't understand what being racist and anti-racist mean. You can't not be, there's no such thing as not racist, which is what a majority of people say. You're either racist or it's anti-racist, and we can't call ourselves anti-racist until we recognize how everyone can be racist. So he
That's
breaks that
interesting.
down. And I think once people start to get that, then we will see people understanding why a school having or a military having a policy on the books saying you can't wear locks, you know, you can't wear braids. He really historically weaves for you how those
Yeah.
basic ideas manifest in those ways. And again, when you say diversity and inclusion, people aren't thinking about those things.
No, 100%. And it's funny, man. Like, people that don't see these things and how they affect, like generations, like being socialized in certain ways of not understanding why the African American experience has been the way it has. I had a young lady who's very new to the Coast Guard. She was amazed at the fact that I go camping and I kayak and I swim and I listen to like all different types of music. She's like, "Well, I'm from Mississippi, and like all the black people I know, they don't." It's like, I'm like, you really have to realize there is especially in a state like Mississippi, there's a reason why you have not seen any black people kayak. There's a reason why you haven't seen black people swimming in a swimming pool. There's a reason why you haven't seen black people hiking in wherever you can hike in Mississippi.
Right.
It's like they weren't legally allowed to be there.
It was
and
actually
being there,
it was a threat to your life.
it's just that's your life. So it's like when you see these folks, like, nah, man, that's some white shit. Or they say that to you. This is like they're not saying it because, black people don't do that.
Right.
They're saying is like these are things that only white people are allowed to do and have been allowed to do. And it's not like my parents are gonna teach me how to like go out and kayak if their grandparents were seeing people getting killed and lynched and disappeared. And stolen out of their home and never seen again or come back beaten up or whatever because they wanted to go fishing at a lake.
Or running, right, in their neighborhood.
Or
as
running.
we-
Oh, yeah, right. In 2020.
Right.
Yeah, and
So there's
running
a
in the
reason.
neighborhood.
There's a reason.
Yeah, there's a reason. Because
There's a reason.
black people are risk averse to certain activities because It's like, nah, no, that sounds like a setup. That sounds
Exactly.
like, oh, I'm gonna openly make myself a target. People are gonna ask my or wonder my presence in this place. What's that black person doing here? The fact that you're thinking that is a very strong problem. And until
Exactly.
folks stop thinking,
Right. And that's where I mean, I stayed with that for a while actually as I was thinking like, okay, how do I move this conversation forward? The idea of value kept coming back to me, right? Because if someone can't kayak, if someone can't swim or run, it's because you literally have decided the value of their life. And you have to remember, I intentionally went to business school because I wanted to understand that. So here I am in these classrooms, like from a capitalist market perspective, I'm understanding what value means. But then, as a diversity and inclusion professional, what I'm challenged with in organizations is people saying, you don't create value. Someone actually sat me down, self prescribed himself as my mentor. And this was a white gay man. And I have to say that because I'll be honest, I expected a white man at some point to sit me down or in some way tell me that my work wasn't valuable, right? That was an expectation that I had doing diversity work. But I become perplexed when other minority groups or other underrepresented or marginalized or historically oppressed people, have questions like that seem silly to me. But anyway,
yeah,
he said
yeah,
his point was, what are you proud of, or what have you done? And it was at that moment that I realized, like, oh, okay, it's time for me to go. But it's funny. The next day, he texted me because this was someone who was a friend because he recognized it, but he didn't recognize it enough not to do it. So it affirmed for me that this idea of value. And then, I mean, Stephen, then I got headier about it, right? And then was thinking like, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure that besides land and maybe spices, I don't know, I'm no expert, but black bodies were one of the first things brought and sold in this country. And so
100%.
when we talk about creating a product to be sold on the market, it that to me just deepened it, right? And that's again why I have to say anti-racist in my work, because it's like I can't keep going into these companies and these organizations that have products and service, even if they're nonprofit, right? And you're asking me what's the value of diversity and inclusion. You're asking me, this was a question that I got specifically from a leader of an organization, nonetheless, the person at the top. Well, what are the key performance indicators? Right, and that's a question that you ask. What are the key performance
Yeah,
indicator of this product on the
yeah,
market? Why should I invest in this, and what are the quantitative things that will help me lessen my anxiety about that risk, right?
yeah,
But this is a question people ask, for instance, around a diversity strategy, and often you find that there's no general strategy. And so again, the question of, you don't understand how to value human beings that have other identities that are not dominant. Period. That is
yeah.
what companies do not understand. For profit and nonprofit. It's like you hire this diversity person to come into your organization because you understand that the value of having different people and problem solving and more profit, creativity is increased, etc. So that's value, but those implicit things around policy and hair that go overlooked, or honestly, or unconscious bias, right? They're not aware that these
Right,
things are happening, or
right.
there
And no
might.
one's challenging them on that and it keeps reaffirming and solidifying why and how they think that way. So then it's not. So then you come along and you're trying to slowly lift this veil off their eyes, and it's like, nah, I don't like that, and it just
Exactly.
slowly pull the curtain back down.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then, so I finally got really frustrated. I was like, no. And that's that's hard for me, right? Because I had already, you can call me an angry black woman. If the shoe fits, and I have a lot to be angry about. I'll take that. I'm one of those people. It's so funny. People I just watched the Michelle Obama documentary, and she talks about how she was perceived as that, and on the cover of, what was it, the New Yorker, I think, where they had her dressed, the assault rifle. I can own that, being angry. I'm black and a woman, right? But to not understand diversity, to not understand that there's a need to have a disciplined way of approaching the way that we interact with each other at this point in time, and not understand that we have to create and maintain some product or service that we sustain to help us do that on this planet, right? And not leave it up to, in our organizations, in our countries, right? You think about it on an international stage. Even part of my training, one of the most important pieces of my training was, it was called Sustained Dialogue Network. I'm trying to remember the name of the organization. Sustained Campus Dialogue Network, I think. But it was started by the same person, a professor who was involved in the negotiations in, was it Arab-Israeli war, I believe, and came back to, it was a Princeton professor. He came back to campus, and his students wanted to know, how did you do that, right? How do you negotiate peace like that? And so his methodology, he transformed to also use around social justice issues.
Okay.
And so that's when I began to understand and really piece together my charge in wanting to up the ante and people understanding the value of diversity and inclusion. It's not just because people are offended. It's not just because, a moral, something morally we need to do. If this capitalist system is where we are right now, then that even is not being exhibited, because we are still literally operating as if slavery, right? We're still operating off of, let's not think about what this person has to offer. We're going to put on what this person has to offer. We are going to make assumptions about what a person has to offer in my organization. And then because of quote unquote best practices and research, I'm told that you might be offended at some things, so I'm going to hire someone to make you feel better. And we call that diversity and inclusion. And now I'm sure you see diversity and inclusion is on par with white genocide, I think. I think people are now saying that.
Yeah, people
diversity,
have, yeah.
It's like, wow.
People having knowledge.
Wow. That's right. And that's fear. Talk about being risk averse. You say something like that when you fear that there's a genocide coming. You really think that something is out to destroy you. And the fact that having understanding, having peace, having a harmonious or circular economy that really benefits everyone is genocide against you, versus understanding how it enhances your ability to sustain your life on this planet at this point.
Right.
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 That's what continues to make me want to do the work. It's just that now I understand that I have to do it differently, right? Because language is important. And for so long, something like diversity and inclusion, people assumed that it was just, all right, these people don't feel, boo-hoo, they don't feel included. Instead of really thinking about value.
Which is always funny because, it exists in numerous organizations. The idea of when whiteness is not included, or the center point of a discussion or a topic, it must not be for them, or it's dangerous, or it's somehow it's wrong, or it's probably negative, or it's too obscure to understand. And it's for the first time for a lot of people, they are having to think about what it means to be white. They are having to think about what an African American woman, man, what a child would have to be exposed to in life growing up in the United States. And it is, I've had grown people tell me like, "Oh, I just watched 13th. I just watched the documentary 13th," or I recommended a book to one of my friends who's kind of not very. He's conservative, like he's center, right of center, and I recommended him. I'm trying to find this book right now. I want to make sure I get the title because I think people should actually should read it and should check it out. See, I'm about to pull it up real quick. Oh, The Color of Law. That's what it is. And it's basically this entire story of like how segregation in housing affects us today, and it like completely walks its way through.
Right.
And it's like the creation of the middle class after World War One, and all these troops coming home, getting VA loans,
GI
buying
Bill.
homes, getting a GI Bill, being able to go to college, and very socialist program. Everything that comes out the New Deal, creating these safety nets for people. But then, all this great things are happening. Guess what? None of those black people are getting those benefits.
Right.
Lost a leg, lost an arm, lost their mind, lost their family, lost their friends. They come back home and they're not. Very small number of those folks are getting those benefits and are able to figure it out.
And you know what, Stephen?
And
I don't. Sorry to interrupt you. Isn't it
No,
funny?
you good,
My father benefited from that, and I really cite that as like, wow. What if he didn't? What would my life look
Yeah,
like?
100%.
What would my life look like if he didn't get that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Now I look at myself. I'm just like, like there are so many people. There's this retired World War II. I think he's passed away now. Master Chief. His name was Master Chief McLeod or McLeod, and he was talking about how like when you join the Coast Guard, you can only be 3 jobs. You could be a cook, you could be a storekeeper, and you could be a like a yeoman or a messman, basically. So like you can clean, cook, and you can stock the shelves,
Right.
and that's basically all you can do. And those dudes came in a time where, you know, they had the shittiest jobs. They got the worst boats, but they figured it out, and then they're rewarded with eventually if they stayed in long enough and they fought and they were able to like petition Congress and like get these things going through, and you have all these NGOs and all these nonprofits coming together and like, you know what? How are you gonna have your black soldiers and some of the Hispanics, because some of them were considered white and some of them weren't considered. Some of them weren't considered white. It's like, how are you going to have them going out doing the same jobs, and then now they come home and they can't get their benefits?
Right.
So yeah, it was always and then the banks being in on that whole thing, and like banks not giving loans, even if you did qualify for your GI Bill and you did qualify for the VA loans,
You still
no
couldn't afford
bank
it.
was going to give you. You couldn't afford it. The bank would like charge you like 2 times with a mortgage of just like the same as if it was white. And then you had people who would get lawyers, make companies, make LLCs, and that's how they'd have to get their VA loans. Like it was all these roundabout ways these guys used to have to fucking figure it out. And then now I have to sit here. You have to sit in front of these people and tell them what the benefit of diversity and inclusion
Exactly.
is.
And it's so, yes. And it makes me, and from a career perspective, right, if I wanted to be selfish, God forbid I be
Right.
selfish and think about from a career perspective.
Oh, Katrina.
if I'm ambitious, if I want to have a career, what do I study? You don't get a degree in diversity and inclusion. And so when you get into these roles, I have what I have. And for me, I have business management. That's what I know. But if I mean, think about it. I want people to really understand these people in these roles. You're hired, you come in, essentially you're working with an 8 hour time frame, right? You only have a day, and people have their jobs to do. And if people don't understand that history, where do you
Yeah.
begin? Where do you
Exactly.
begin? And
Yeah.
I can't show up at tables and say, all right, let's spend 5 minutes and let me give you a rundown on the GI Bill and the history of urbanization of America, whatever. I can't do that if, especially, let's say I work at, in a school in a HR department. Like, why am I
Yeah.
coming in and talking about that? So I learned that, okay, I can't be an expert in everything, because there was a time where I felt like I needed to get a PhD because the Color of Law, the book that you're talking about, I felt like if I didn't write that book, then I can't be at the table helping people say these things.
Right. Right.
That just made me think, like, that's why I had to go the design thinking and the innovation, because the information and knowledge is there around why we have to do this. But then I realized, like, oh, okay, so that's a part of my role too, the learning and development piece. I realized that it's not even diversity and inclusion that we're talking about. It's about learning and development too,
Yeah.
at a basic level.
Yeah. And it's just like anything, trying to learn, trying to teach anyone something, some new skill or whatever. They are where they are, and you have to reach them and teach them from where they're at, and then kind of go on from there. And when you have these socially reinforced, negative socially reinforced norms of like, oh, they're very averse to like, oh, this is a black topic, or this is a Latina topic, or this is about gay people, and it's like it's you. It's about you and how you're thinking about, because it's like, oh, this is about Hispanic women and how they're being marginalized in, let's say, for like women who are being abused who work in like cleaning services,
Yes.
which is a big issue, like that it does exist. And then you work at this company, you run this company, it's like, oh, I don't understand how this is an issue. Like, we contract those people. And
Right.
like, it's happening on these crimes. These crimes are happening on your property. This is why it exists.
Right. There's no
And
responsibility for it. There's no
Yeah.
accountability for it. And I spent a lot of time going down that route, right? Thinking about specifically if I were white. And that's honestly, this has always been how I approached it. I've had deep empathy, honestly, for white people. If I were white, and if in all these conversations I'm the dominant one and I'm the problem and I'm the villain, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
So that's the value piece, but like you're saying, it's more than that in how people relate to their accountability and responsibility. So I would go to there's a conference called White Privilege Conference. And I presented there with a woman who was born and raised in the same neighborhood as my college, Babson College. So up in Wellesley, I believe it's the most educated town, like the most concentration of education in the country. In the country, so very intelligent people, lots of knowledge,
Right.
but still struggling to find out the value of talking about race. And so this woman is a white woman who is married to a black man and has biracial, children, and really passionate about getting
Yeah.
white people to understand that racism needs to end.
Yeah.
So our conversation started around value because down the street, Wellesley College, Peggy McIntosh is a professor there, but she coined the term white privilege. She wrote an essay. You could Google it quick and find it. Unpacking Your Invisible Knapsack. That's what really, and I think she wrote in like 79, maybe 70s.
Oh wow. Yeah.
But it's a short essay, and then she lists all these things that white people don't have to think about in their invisible knapsack, and that's what sparked the conversation of white privilege. And so my friend, I actually should say her name, Michelle Chalmers, because she also authors a couple of children's books talking about how to talk to kids about race. So anyway, our conversation started around valuing racism, valuing dismantling racism, and Peggy McIntosh talks about white privilege as a liability.
Mm.
Excuse me, a set of unearned assets.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I get that. I get that.
That's what she
It's like
says.
a what is that called? Like it's like an inheritance. I'm trying to think of the tax. It is kind of an inheritance tax, but not in the way that people think of it. Like,
Exactly. Exactly. So unearned assets that you have. And Michelle's perspective is really, you know, I lose something too. I lose a part of my humanity if I don't let go
mm-hmm.
of white privilege. Someone who she identifies as Italian. She knows that her family is from Italy. She don't speak Italian. She's never been to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And the dancing and the culture. She feels like she
Yeah.
lost a part of that, and so she's trying to get other white people to understand, like, you lose too. And so anyway, me and my business management mind, I was like, okay, well, if Peggy McIntosh has established it as an asset, how do we get white people to see it as a liability?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's, traditionally that seems to be what dominant culture values, right? Money. So if we can put it
Right.
in those contexts, maybe we get some action. So we would go to the White Privilege Conference. It's been around for 20 years, which was impressive and fascinating to me, by a black man, Dr. Eddie Moore, and it moves from city to city. We were in St. Louis, we were in Las Vegas, and it's brilliant because it's a really nice conference because he roots it. Whoever the first peoples on that land were, they open up the conference, welcome everyone. It's just a really inclusive, the way inclusion should be. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, we started these conversations at this conference and got mixed reviews. Most people got it, but their questions still were, but what do I do? So it's like, even if you can get the mindset right, people understand, like, okay, I see how I'm losing my humanity by not being able to figuratively give up something. They still don't have an idea of, how do I manifest this in real life? How do I
Mm.
manifest this? I mean, I had a minister, a woman from Michigan, sit beside me, and we were talking, and she was like, I know that my congregation is racist. It's predominantly white, and I know my congregation is
Mm.
racist. And this is why I was like, I'm so crazy. Because I said to her, I was like, well, what would Jesus do? But
You are. Boy, that's in that moment, in that space. That was probably mad deep. That could have. You're
because it
so
was
silly.
like, but I was my mind, because
What? Why are you doing this to me? Okay. All right.
because it was like, all right. But it blew my mind. It blew my
Mm.
mind because I remember the workshop we were in. It was specifically about how to, in the moment, combat racism in the moment.
Mm.
So it was talking about practical skills, about when someone says something, how you interrupt them, etc. But
Mm.
she was asking me, like, I lead a whole congregation of people, and I'm a minister and all this stuff, and I just don't know what to do. I was like, so anyway, that helped me turn down, or made me have a more realistic understanding of how hard it would be to make people value something that for so
Right.
long they haven't had to.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like in the concept of the two things. It's funny that this is coming back around, and that's this thought process, this conversation I'm having, because I've had this earlier this week.
Mm.
Because it was Malcolm X's
Yep.
birthday just recently, and there's a pro Second Amendment gentleman that I follow called Maj Toure, and he posted it, and he was talking about the Democratic Party, and he was talking about. I mean, this is when Malcolm was alive, and you're seeing it in black and white, and he's having this conversation, and he's just like, if the Democratic Party can't give you anything, and you keep voting for them, and they keep telling you that we're your party, but they're not doing anything for you, then you're not being. It's like you're a political chump, and you're being a traitor to your race. And in the comments, another white gentleman said, "What does it look like when white people are traitors to their race?" And then I thought about it, and I was like, honestly, the adaptation and the creation of the term whiteness was a complete sellout to your Irish heritage, your Italian, your Polish, like all that heritage, because it's gone. You come to America and you become white, and then you just, all of that goes away. Like you purge yourself from, like, you're not making it. Like you go to a German town, like 100 years ago, and it might really look like a German town.
Right.
This is why a lot of these, like, you go to like Little Tokyo in certain places, like it still looks like, oh, this is what it kind of looks like. It's like, maybe outside of Tokyo or a couple in the suburbs or something. But there was a very I'm trying to think. I think it's Bacon's Rebellion. Like after like those poor whites and those indentured servants and natives and black folks teamed up and started burning down like these Virginia farms and overthrowing like the yoke that was on anyone that just did not own land, who wasn't in a position of power. Once that whole rebellion got squashed, in turn, what basically got cooked up in Britain and then sold back into the U.S. was like, oh, you're American now, but you're not Polish, you're not Irish anymore. You are now part of the white race. Like so, like now it's equal footing.
Right.
So like you're white, you're better than these Negroes, than these coloreds, than whatever we termed in that.
Indians.
Yeah, these Indians. You know what I'm saying? You're the closest thing to God, and then it becomes this political and psychological footing and tool that they can like get out of just feeling this way. And then now it's like, oh, okay, you can't beat your white slaves, your white indentured servants, landowners. You have to give them a rest on Sunday, like fully. You can't make them work on Sunday. You can't do this to them. You have to give them a certain amount of land so they can start building on. You give them roles above all these Africans that we've captured now. Like you can't treat them exactly the same. And then that trade up still persists to this day.
It does.
Where you can have somebody who's a poor white person in a trailer park, and you could have somebody that's a comedian. He was talking about it the other day. I was dying laughing at how insanely true and sad it was. Like, so Will Smith could walk into a trailer park somewhere in Louisiana, Mississippi, and it's Will Smith. Everybody loves Will Smith, and he could still, dude could open up his trailer park door, living in squalor, and it said, "At least I'm not black," and could still penetrate the one of the most loved Americans, one of the most loved actors of all time, and mentally he's correct because he understands the game is getting played on a longer scale, and it's like, what is that person giving up? And like you said, their humanity. Because you think the lack of melanin, lack of dermal melanin in your skin somehow makes you better in a real sense. It's like, okay, socially, politically, maybe in this timeline, yeah, but give it 50 years. Right.
And the emotions, right, around facing that. I get that it's hard, but, because I really do think about it, and I've seen it. I've sat in front of many white people intentionally over the last 10 years, and when you can see the wheels turning in someone's head when you give new information anyway, but when you really are talking about their history or changing the way that they see something, I see the horror, I see, right, and I can understand how that can create doubt. I understand how it can create trauma and all these things. And still, I say, imagine people who that's our reality, right? Like that's the pain of having to know what was done to your great grandmother, like the pain of having to, like that. Of me having to face my heritage, you have to face yours. And it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that conversation continues to evolve, because I guess I see a lot of white people coming to that realization, right? They read history, I see, and some are upset, because they feel duped and they didn't know those things, and they have that
Mm-hmm.
realization, but then for some reason, still translating it to action is just hard. And
Yeah.
so what I what I what I'm hoping to do, maybe, not maybe, what I'm doing is still, if I can have them understand the approach of creating, I don't know, of action, right? Taking action around
Right.
whatever you need to call it. First, having that self awareness, but I think it's also a conversation now about wellness,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm trying to think of another way to frame the conversation, right? So if we talk about it as wellness, then you as an individual understanding how all the pieces of yourself have a different culture, have a different history.
Right.
They've all affected you differently in your life and impact the way that you show up, and the value that you can contribute as an employee, as a
Mm-hmm.
citizen, etc. So, not understanding your race is makes you not well, and you understanding who you are, and wrestling with it, and understanding that it changes and it evolves is a good thing, and that leads to growth. So that for me was an aha moment of, not only is it diversity inclusion, not only is it anti-racist, but it's also wellness.
Mm-hmm.
And wellness in your organization is more than, okay, we can sponsor massages for everyone, or wellness, free pizza, or a food truck will be outside today. Like,
Right.
let's talk about wellness. And if we can start seeing, racism in our world as being not well because of the way that we perceive ourselves and others.
Yeah.
But then, you know, that's personal development, right? But the
Right.
connection to, why, how does this matter to my work? Because as a businesswoman, that's how I have to think of it. So I can sell that, right? Wellness,
Mm-hmm.
that's valuable, but what does it have to do with my work? So I'm seeing my challenge now. Most recently is white people's patience. If you do, and I can't just, I'll stop picking on white people, because it really is everyone, right? When you gain new insight, you become a little bit enlightened, and you try to apply it. It's going to take years. you
Mm-hmm.
know, I guess, it's easy for me to focus on white people because a lot of black people have had their whole lives
Right.
to,
You have master's degrees in trauma and racial bargaining and dangers and all of it and all of it.
and how to
We there's
cope and
no
how to overcome.
hmm we don't, there's no option. Like
You
especially if
feel,
you're from anywhere where we are, like there is no option. You have to figure it out.
yes, yes. And honestly, that's I'm glad you said that, because that's why I came back to Maryland. Because I
Yeah.
mean, my thinking was, okay, I need to be in spaces where, if we are able to move the conversation forward, I need to be able to quickly have a platform to be able to share it, right? So why
Right.
wouldn't I want to be in elite spaces where there's resources and research going on? But then realizing, okay, I can sit here and bang my head against the wall, but the suffering that I'm really trying to alleviate, theoretically it manifests here, but the
Mm-hmm.
real negative impact of people not understanding the value of diversity and inclusion is hitting way too close to home for me, literally. You look in Maryland, PG County, the town, Capitol Heights,
Mm-hmm.
even in my own family, seeing people struggle. You know, I'm no longer waiting for people. I'm tired of trying to convince people of what I know to be true,
Mm-hmm.
and instead shifting to just demonstrating it as much as possible, and having conversations with people who even if they don't fully get it, are open minded enough to take the risk
Right.
and be creative. Because there's another element. I think you and I talked about this, but for me to really be my authentic self and to tap into, I think it was in the context of learning. People learn different. I think, and it might just be as simple as like tacit knowledge, right?
Right. Right.
And having the space and the authority to make that valuable in an organization. What I found, and I think this is true for Black people and Black women in America especially, is there's no space for that, and for us in an organization, right? The knowledge that
That
you
space is on cruise ships. That's why I find those spaces like trips to the Bahamas. That space exists on. Let's have a girls' week and go X, Y, and
right,
Z, and it's like, yeah,
right, right. And unless you make your whole life a girls' week, then what do you do? So yeah, I think seeing it close to home, I think inspires me. It really does, because I think those people who are not afraid to try different methods to, you know, move things from a bunch of theory to practice, they're here. And I was sacrificing a lot, right? Like, I wasn't near my community. I was isolated. We didn't even talk
yeah,
about the impact on me, the individual,
yeah.
right? That's the story of me trying to take an idea and turn it into an opportunity. But I think there's another element of that a lot of people, young people, I think our generation, we are an idea. Like,
Right.
I'm an
No,
idea.
100%.
And so, especially me, or I think a lot of people who are so passionate or focused on justice or change, you forget, like, you are human too. While trying to convince people to understand and remember their own humanity, it's easy for you to realize, like, you got to eat healthy too. You got to take care of yourself. And it's been so mind-blowing to me that instantly, me coming home, me being in familiar spaces, and me not having to be on display as much, and having to contort myself so much. That alone just has increased my productivity. I've seen just mental health, just everything increase. And so I made the right decision. But it's fascinating for me, like, how that manifests. We don't think about the people who are doing the work, how it manifests in their life, you know?
Yeah, it's hard, man, because people come to you
Right.
not understanding that me, you personally, Katrina is, yeah, I'm on E right now. I am on E, but I'm gonna give you what I got.
Right.
And it's hard to keep doing this work because, like, you do care about it. It is important to you. It is like your passion in life. But I mean, just because of all those things doesn't mean that it does not wear you down, because it is hard to try to explain. And I think this is a realization, and we've talked about this before, just like, being tired of trying to convince people to be human, and then to also to see you as human, because it's just like you've surrendered, and we've already talked in this conversation, you've surrendered your humanity every time you walk over, walk past, walk on, or stand on the shoulders, the bodies, the ideas, the identity of all these people, and you're trying to, you're struggling to understand their value or their pain or their history. I can only imagine, like, you doing this professionally.
Wait, say
How
that last
burnt
part
out.
again.
I can only imagine, like, how with
Before
you
that,
doing
I
this.
didn't hear before you said that.
Oh, wait, what part? Like, what's the last thing you heard?
You broke up a little bit. I didn't.
Oh, my bad. With you doing this professionally, there's an expectation that you're gonna be at 100 at all times.
Right.
But then, you're dealing with people who are trading off their humanity and, in a sense, their divinity, struggling to see that in others.
Exactly. Exactly.
So how do you like what's your ritual to try and like detox from all of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Um,
Okay.
yeah. How do I cope? How do I restore, um,
Mm-hmm.
replenish? It's it's a journey, right? And I have to be specific in calling it a healing journey. And I've always been open to what that means. I've never been one to run away from talking about mental health or something. Um, and I started that process while I was still doing the work in Massachusetts. So therapy definitely is
Mm-hmm.
helpful. Because in a lot of situations like that, you could be painted out to be crazy. Like I had someone sit me down, and this was the beginning of the end. Isn't this a pattern, like people sitting me down and feeling like they can tell me something?
I promise you, I've never sat you down in the past, and I am never going to sit you down in the future. If I sit you down, it's going to be at a nice table because we about to have a
Hey,
meal or something.
exactly.
It's not to tell you about yourself, unless it's in a positive.
Exactly. So this person sat me down, and it made me mad because I think I had set up the lunch. I was like, oh, let's have lunch. And I had some questions and things that I had. Well, essentially, she was trying to make me a token in her office.
Mm.
Right. And then here verbatim, she said, I just see you in meetings now, and I can see you getting upset, you know, basically implying that like you're becoming an angry black woman, and so you need to not do that work. Maybe if you shift to focus on, this was academic advising versus being a
Mm.
diversity program, whatever. You wouldn't be as angry. You'd be happier. You'd be better. So I had to go. Therapy for me was a sounding board for me to realize that that wasn't okay. I know that's not okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
those sorts of things, Michelle Obama actually in this documentary, and it's really helping me frame things. But she's like, you can walk around and act like that stuff doesn't hurt and doesn't affect you, but it's sort of like you drinking poison and hoping that the other person dies.
Yeah.
And so that was so therapy was really instrumental for me in processing that stuff. But I quickly got frustrated, Stephen, I have to say, because you think about how behavioral therapists are trained. What do they
Mm-hmm.
really don't know how to care for someone who has dealt with what I would consider racial trauma or racial
Yeah. Terrorism.
fatigue.
Yeah.
Terrorism, fatigue, everything. I mean, when I was it's funny.
Oh, I know
Sandra
that face.
Bland, Sandra Bland's
Mm-hmm.
name has come up today for interesting reasons related to Doja Cat. I couldn't figure it out this morning, but
Oh yeah, I saw that. Oh man.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I have some insight, and we'll talk
okay,
off. Yeah,
I
we'll
need
talk
that. I thought
offline.
about you. I was like,
Yeah.
what? So
Yeah.
yeah, but okay. So Sandra Bland, was killed, I believe, when she was 28 years old. And it's a coincidence. She was a diversity administrator at a college. And guess who also was 28 years old and an administrator at a college? I was. I was 28 years old and an administrator of a college when I saw that flash across my phone. Yeah, and I was also doing that work when Trayvon Martin was killed. And for
Yeah.
me, think about what I'm doing, right? So I'm always in these conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm working with young people, and I'm already as a diversity person doing this work, and especially as a person of color, you're always torn because you have, in my case, students coming to you. They have complaints, they have issues, they have concerns, and
Mm-hmm.
technically, for most of it, you can't do anything. That's the reality, right? Someone, microaggressions, for instance, that they experience in the classroom or whatever. Like, I can't do anything technically about that, you know, unless it's illegal, unless they harm you in any way. There's no policy against, like, oh, my professor implied that black people are inferior, so that affects me, right? I want to fix, I want to help, I want to save, I want to nurture, and I can. And then I see the Trayvon Martin case where, well, the acquittal that happened, and whatever happened in that case. And that to me was a new level. I think, that's where Black Lives Matter and everything started. But remember, I'm in the corner of Wellesley, and it just hit me. So all those things were happening, and that's why therapy was needed. on
Yeah.
top
No,
of
that,
on top of personal stuff that was happening to me, just circumstances of that environment. When I went to school, after celebrating that I was going to college, family and friends were like, "You're going where?" Just the region is known to be racist. And as an undergraduate student, I found myself on that campus telling that to people so that they could understand the Black experience. But anyway, therapy was needed, and that has been instrumental in me caring for myself. It really
yeah.
was. So therapy, but then trying to find the right community for me to be a part of. I think obviously being in any sort of sister circle, or always having Black women around me who have gone through the same thing. That's always been important. For instance, I never pledged a Black Greek organization. Instead, I pledged a historically white sorority. I was a founding member of the chapter on campus. That's a whole nother story. But I guess I'm saying the traditional built-in communities that a lot of Black women might have, because I'm me, I didn't have a lot of those. So I had to be really creative about who I'm connected to. So things like that. And then coming home, I went through all sorts of things to try to. I felt like I couldn't focus a lot, and as someone who has been a high achiever, someone who's very ambitious, like me not being able to focus is a problem. So of course, I mean, I emptied my HSA accounts, like taking all these tests. I wanted to be diagnosed with something at a certain point because I was like, why am I not able to focus? It's because I was stressed. It's because
Yeah.
that's trauma. That is trauma. And so recognizing that, and then even when you recognize the emotional parts of it, I still wasn't accounting for the things that happened professionally, like at work, like those stories, those vignettes that I'm telling you. I wiped those away, right? Like those things didn't matter. That was just part of the job. That was just part of the job, you know. I'm fine. Of course, that white woman sat me down. I don't care, That's. But then when you realize, like Katrina, you can't focus, right? Like there's still these things. And then I finally, and moving back to Maryland helped me really go deeper. It's not that it was new to me. It's not that I hadn't unpacked it. It's just deeper. And I realized, most people, so I guess I should say that another tool for me was very conscious reflection. Like even today, I'm spending a lot of time journaling because for me, that's always been a tool to help cope with things. And I stopped doing that for a while. So once I really started doing that more consistently, it's definitely helped. And there's a lot of reasons why I wasn't doing that, right?
Right. Right.
I mean, seriously, for when you do this sort of work, I don't know, people use things against you, you know? I was very vocal in not even local papers. Like you can Google. I was in my face was in the Boston Globe, talking about issues, etc. And thankfully for me, in minor ways, there was retaliation. There's retaliation, and again, for me, someone who's always been passionate about this job, who's always been pushed to speak my mind and everything, it's part of the job. Right?
Yeah.
And to a certain
Yeah.
extent, it is. And so I'm really leaning into communities that are really focused on wellness, specifically around racial trauma, specifically around social justice work. And I'm really happy that that conversation is happening so explicitly now, where the focus is, and we've had this conversation too, stop trying to focus as much, or at least balance the attention on trying to get people to understand something and switch it to taking care of and centering ourselves and minority populations. And so
Yeah.
you hear conversations that are really rooted in rest, you know.
Yeah.
For years, Stephen, I still do it. Like, I always have my laptop with me. When I come home, my laptop is open because I always have to be on and working. Because if I'm not, then I'm being lazy. Then I'm not, or all that stuff.
No, I
So,
understand. Right.
and so the conversations, it's called the Nap Ministry, is one of my favorite accounts on Instagram, but always just
Mm.
centering like sleep. Like, no, you want to take a nap? Go take a nap. Little things like that, especially as black women, you can't do. And so that's a new journey for me. That's a new path.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited about it because I'm realizing how much people need permission to do that. I've supported so many students and employees who are hurting. And so if I push myself to go down that journey, that'll just add more tools for me to be able to, in my business, right, and the impact that I hope to make, what will make. But yeah, that's where I am. That's where I am now, realizing that being an entrepreneur is not a joke. I never thought it was a joke.
No.
That's why I intentionally went to get training to be one. But now that it's time to activate, I really am thinking about the reality of taking care of myself first, as I'm thinking about, eventually I want a family. I want all these responsibilities, but,
Mm-hmm.
balancing that with the work and always making sure that I can take care of myself, because this work will tear you apart.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%, man.
Yeah.
Especially, it's one thing to just be like, oh, I'm in the comment section and I'm going ham, but you are going into boardrooms, you are going into conference rooms, you're standing up in front of people, you're taking risks to be in front of, not just like, oh, I was in the shade room. It's like, no, you're in the Boston Globe. Like, no,
Yeah.
there's some things
Yeah.
that folks are gonna be able to, yeah,
And there's new levels, I've it's been a huge burden and pain for me to not be I wanted to be out there. I wanted to be in the shade room because I think more people probably now watch the shade room
yeah,
than they
especially
do
now.
the Boston Globe, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but in seeing all of those things, I realized that I too have to be cautious about risk, because
yeah,
unfortunately, the impact that you want to make, I have to think about the routes to take, because as a black woman who wants to talk about these things, you easily get pushed into other circles, and I just always want to make sure that I'm able to be in the circles I want to be in and need to be
mm-hmm.
in.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And that is another form of self care, just making sure that you're in the right spaces
Mhm.
and keeping yourself out of this right space, yeah, the wrong spaces rather.
Mhm. Mhm.
Man, Katrina, man, thank you for like agreeing to do this. This has been super awesome.
Thank you.
Tell folks where they can, how, and they can get a hold of you if they're trying to have these conversations at length. I
Mhm.
think in the future, I definitely want to like assist in creating media for you and doing all this stuff
Definitely
together.
need
This
that.
is part of the reason. Yeah, it's part of the reason. Like I got all this stuff, all this doggone equipment anyway, trying to produce stuff for people like you who are out here really doing the work. So yeah, how can folks get a hold of you?
Sure. So website is the name of my company is Kelda Co. Kelda is my mother's name. So
Mm-hmm.
www.keldaco.com, KELDA. So I'm there, but on Instagram mostly is my social media of choice. So my personal account is It's Katrina. Something in my room is falling apart.
Okay.
I'm okay. I'm okay.
Okay.
My personal account is It's Katrina Elise. It's KatrinaElise. And then Kelda Co. Kelda _Co is my company Instagram. which I'm building, which I probably need your help for.
I got you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
After all this COVID shenanigans is done, I'm definitely making my way back to Maryland, and we're gonna sit down and well, prior to that, we're gonna sit down and figure out what you need, and then we're gonna make sure we get that done.
yes, appreciate you. Shout out to
Yeah,
you
man,
doing
appreciate
this.
you too. I'm trying, man. I'm trying.
Until next time, right?
Until next time, thanks everybody for listening and watching. It's a night show.